Mom is rushed to the hospital with a mystery illness.
Finally, she got an x-ray.
Brian, did you try to kill your wife? Did you give your wife pills laced with lead?
Did you try to poison your wife?
No.
Soft enough to scrape off with a knife and put in a little capsule?
In the summer of 2021, Hannah set a small pill on her tongue, swallowed it with a sip of water, and went back to caring for her children. It was an ordinary moment, the kind that disappears into the blur of a busy young mother's day. She had no idea that the person who handed her that pill was watching, waiting, and that what was inside it was already beginning to destroy her from the inside out. Her full name was Hannah Pettey, and in the summer of 2021, she was 22 years old, living in Hartselle, Alabama, a small, tight-knit city of roughly 15,000 people nestled in Morgan County in the northern part of the state. Hartselle is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where high school football matters, where faith runs deep, and where the word community actually means something. It is not the kind of place where you expect evil to take root quietly, inside a family home, behind a closed bedroom door. Hannah was, by every account, warm and deeply caring. Those who knew her described her as intelligent and devoted, a young woman who poured herself into the people she loved. She was a mother first and foremost, and the center of her world was her two small children, her son Lincoln, who was 3 years old in early 2022, and her daughter Gracie, who had just turned 2. Hannah loved those children with a fierceness that radiated from everything she did. Even in her sickest moments, moments that would have broken many people, her first thought was for them. She was also a woman with ambitions beyond her front door. Hannah was working toward a college degree in education, dreaming of becoming a teacher. And there was something deeply fitting about that dream. People who knew her could easily picture her at the front of a classroom, patient, encouraging, the kind of teacher who remembers which kids need extra time and which ones need someone to believe in them. She had that quality naturally. She made people feel seen. Hannah was not perfect. No person is. She was navigating the painful, messy reality of a marriage that had begun to fracture. By 2021, her relationship with her husband, Brian Mann, had deteriorated significantly. The couple were in the process of a difficult divorce, and the strain of it weighed on her. She was a young woman trying to hold her family together while her world shifted beneath her feet. But she was doing it. She kept showing up for her kids. She kept moving forward. That resilience was a core part of who she was. Her mother, Nicole Pettey, was one of the most important people in Hannah's life. Their relationship was close, the kind where a daughter calls her mom not just in a crisis, but in the ordinary moments too. Nicole was sharp, attentive, and fiercely protective of her daughter. She would later be the person who saved Hannah's life, though at the time neither of them could have imagined that such a thing would be necessary. Hannah's life in Hartselle had the texture of a place deeply familiar and deeply loved. She moved through her days in a community where her family had roots, where she ran into people she knew at the grocery store and the gas station, where life had a rhythm that felt, on the surface, manageable. Even as her marriage unraveled, she was not alone. She had her mother. She had her children. She had her future. In the summer of 2021, that future included Brian Mann, at least in the complicated way it does when two people share children and a home, even as their romantic relationship collapses. Brian was a licensed chiropractor who operated Advanced Chiropractic, a well-regarded clinic in Decatur, the larger city adjacent to Hartzell. He was 33 years old, physically imposing, a man who took fitness seriously, and professionally respected. His clinic had strong reviews. His patients trusted him. He carried himself with the kind of easy authority that comes from being good at what you do, and knowing it. When Brian suggested to Hannah that summer that she start taking vitamin supplements, it did not seem unusual. According to testimony later given at trial, he framed it as a way to support her immune system during the stress of their divorce proceedings. Hannah trusted him, not in the way she once had, perhaps, but in the way you trust the father of your children to not actively wish you harm. She accepted the capsules. She took them as directed. She was a mother going through a divorce, trying to stay healthy for her kids. By August 2021, things began to feel wrong. It started quietly, the way most terrible things do. A dull ache in her back, some nausea that she might have dismissed as stress. But the symptoms did not pass. They deepened. By the fall, Hannah was losing weight at an alarming rate. Her abdomen was in near constant pain. She was vomiting. She was dizzy. She was exhausted in a way that sleep could not touch. Over the months that followed, she would lose more than 40 pounds from an already slight frame. She would eventually drop to just 84 pounds. She went to doctors, she sought help. But without a clear diagnosis, the visits produced little more than confusion and frustration. No one could explain what was happening to this young woman's body. And through all of it, Brian was there, present, seemingly attentive, even solicitous. According to Hannah's later testimony, it was precisely when she began getting sickest that he was, in her words, the sweetest to him. He brought her things, he encouraged her, and every night he reminded her to take her vitamins. By January 2022, Hannah could barely walk. She was using an office chair to roll from room to room in her own home because she lacked the strength to stand. She had missed her daughter Gracie's second birthday party, not because she wanted to, but because her body had simply given out. She was bedridden. She was disappearing. One night, the pain became unbearable. She called her mother. Nicole Pettey arrived to find her daughter skeletal, barely able to speak. She drove her immediately to UAB, the University of Alabama at Birmingham, one of the state's premier medical facilities. It was the decision that would save Hannah's life. But what doctors would find when they ran their tests would stop them cold. It would transform a medical emergency into something far darker. It would change everything. Hannah Pettey had been slowly, deliberately, systematically poisoned. And the answer to who had done it and why was closer than anyone wanted to believe. There is a particular kind of danger that wears a friendly face. It does not announce itself. It does not lurk in shadows or make people feel afraid. It smiles, it shakes hands, it adjusts your spine and tells you to have a great week. It goes home to a family it appears to love. And all the while, somewhere beneath the surface, it is calculating. Brian Thomas Mann was 33 years old in the summer of 2021, and by every visible measure, he was a man who had made something of himself. He was tall, physically fit, the kind of man who took his body seriously, who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being respected. He lived on Coleman Street Northwest in Hartzell, Alabama, in a house he shared with his wife and 2 young children. He operated Advanced Chiropractic LLC, his own practice at 2112 6th Avenue Southeast in the neighboring city of Decatur. He had built the clinic himself. He owned the land it sat on, through a separate company he had incorporated, a detail that spoke to the methodical, business-minded way he approached his finances. His patients left positive reviews. His neighbors knew him as a family man. What the public records reveal about Brian Mann before the poisoning is a portrait of ambition, financial complexity, and something harder to name. A pattern of behavior that, in retrospect, raises troubling questions about his character. Court records show that in November 2020, before the events of 2021 had even begun, a patient had filed a malpractice lawsuit against him, alleging that a chiropractic procedure he performed left her with immediate severe back pain, incontinence, and an inability to walk, a permanent, debilitating injury, according to the filing. Mann denied those claims. The lawsuit was a shadow hanging over his professional life, even as he continued to practice. But it is the financial picture that tells the most revealing story. Prosecutors would later demonstrate at trial that Mann held 5 separate life insurance policies on his wife Hannah, with combined death benefits totaling $1.3 million. That alone might have been explainable in isolation. Couples take out life insurance, but Mann had also applied for 2 additional policies worth a combined $1.5 million more. Those applications were denied. Insurance agents grew suspicious. According to trial testimony from State Farm agent Chris Humphreys, when someone attempts to obtain multiple policies on a single person across multiple companies, the behavior triggers industry scrutiny. Humphreys testified that Mann had policies at several different insurance companies simultaneously, describing the strategy as throwing spaghetti at the wall, trying every possible route to maximize a payout, hoping one would stick without raising alarms. The policies, prosecutors argued, were not the act of a devoted husband planning for his family's security. They were a blueprint. Understanding how Brian Mann arrived at that blueprint requires looking at the marriage itself. He and Hannah Victoria Pettey had married in Morgan County, Alabama, in April 2018. Hannah was young, still in her early 20s, and Brian was several years her senior. According to Hannah's later testimony, the warning signs existed from the beginning, though they were subtle enough to dismiss at the time. After the wedding, Mann did not want Hannah to work. He deleted her social media accounts. He became, in the clinical language of domestic violence research, isolating, gradually separating her from the broader support networks that might have helped her see what was happening clearly. Hannah later reflected, with the full weight of hindsight, "Looking back, I was isolated." The marriage deteriorated over time. By 2021, the couple were in the process of a painful divorce, and the financial and emotional stakes were rising. Mann had significant assets: his clinic, his property holdings, his professional standing, and a divorce threatened to disrupt everything he had built. According to prosecutors, it was at this point that Brian Mann's calculation shifted from managing a difficult situation to eliminating it entirely. The mechanism he chose was grotesque in its simplicity. During a renovation of his chiropractic office in 2021, contractors had installed lead-lined walls for an X-ray room, a standard feature in medical imaging spaces designed to protect against radiation. The renovation left behind surplus lead construction material. According to trial testimony and investigative reporting, Mann retained some of that leftover lead. He then did something that required only 2 hands and a basic understanding of supplement capsules. He opened the capsules, emptied their contents, depacked the hollow shells with lead shavings, and sealed them back up. They looked, from the outside, exactly like vitamins. They tasted, Hannah would later say, like nothing unusual at all. Beginning in the summer of 2021, Mann gave Hannah these capsules regularly, framing them as immune-boosting multivitamins intended to help her through the stress of the divorce. He encouraged her to take them. According to Hannah's testimony, there were evenings when she felt too sick to swallow anything at all, when the nausea made the idea of putting anything in her mouth unbearable, and Brian would insist. He would place the capsules on her nightstand. He would, in Hannah's own words, freak out if she tried to skip a dose. As Hannah's health declined through the fall of 2021, Mann's behavioral pattern intensified in two contradictory directions simultaneously. On one hand, he was, by Hannah's own account, warmer than he had ever been during their marriage. More attentive, more present. He cooked. He cared for the children. He positioned himself as the devoted husband, nursing a sick wife back to health. A performance that served the dual purpose of appearing innocent and ensuring continued access to his victim. On the other hand, when Hannah's symptoms became severe enough that hospitalization became an obvious necessity, Mann actively worked against it. He opposed her going to the hospital. He expressed concern, not for Hannah's health, but for insurance coverage. According to Hannah's testimony, he was more focused on the policy logistics than on the woman who could barely walk. He also, according to testimony, made Hannah wear ankle weights when she was weighed by hospital staff. She had lost 40 pounds. The weights were meant to disguise how severely her body had deteriorated, to keep the truth from the doctors who were trying to help her, and to keep the insurance policies viable. Because life insurance requires the insured to be in good health. A dying woman cannot be newly insured. When investigators eventually began closing in, Mann attempted a maneuver that revealed, perhaps more clearly than anything else, the cold calculation at the center of his character. He told a nurse practitioner that he and his children were also suffering from lead poisoning. He claimed to have performed an X-ray on himself. He reportedly went as far as presenting what he described as evidence of his own contamination. But when investigators told him he would need to be formally tested, he became, according to testimony, visibly nervous. The subsequent scan found only trace amounts of lead in his system, nothing resembling the catastrophic levels found in Hannah's body, where her blood lead level had reached the 80s, when the medically safe level for an adult is near 10. Brian Mann had constructed his life around the appearance of control. He had built a business, owned property through incorporated entities, taken out insurance policies across multiple companies to avoid triggering investigations at any single one, and maintained the public image of a respected professional and family man. The violence he committed against Hannah was not impulsive. It was not the product of a moment of rage. It was patient, methodical, sustained over months. Each capsule placed on that nightstand was a deliberate act, a choice made again and again across the arc of an entire season from summer through the winter. By January 2022, Hannah weighed 84 pounds. Her colon was packed with lead. Her bones were saturated with a heavy metal that does not leave the body easily and that carries consequences, neurological, reproductive, systemic, for the rest of a person's life. The man who had done this to her was still in the house, still presenting himself as the concerned husband, still managing the insurance paperwork, and Hannah's mother, Nicole, was calling and calling and calling. Hannah finally picked up the phone, but she couldn't speak. She could only gasp. The morning of January 18th, 2022, began like so many mornings before it had in that heart cell home, quietly, painfully, and with Hannah already exhausted before the day had properly started. She had been bedridden for roughly a week by that point, too weak to stand without effort, too nauseated to keep food down, rolling from room to room in that small office chair because walking had become impossible. Her son Lincoln was 3. Her daughter Gracie had just turned 2. Hannah had missed Gracie's birthday party. She had tried to explain that to herself, that she would get better, that this would pass, that she just needed a little more time. But January 18th was the day that story stopped being believable, even to her. She had checked in with her mother, Nicole, that morning by phone. It was a routine call, the kind mothers and daughters share without thinking about. But Nicole heard something in Hannah's voice that stopped her cold. Something underneath the words, a quality she would later describe only as a feeling, a mother's instinct, a certainty that something was deeply, irreparably wrong. After they hung up, Nicole kept calling back. She called and called and called. For a stretch of time that must have felt interminable, there was no answer. When Hannah finally called her back, she couldn't speak. She could only gasp. Then, barely audible, she managed 3 words. "Mom, take me." Brian was at work. He was at his chiropractic clinic in Decatur, tending to patients, adjusting spines, maintaining the professional image he had cultivated for years. Nicole drove to the house and found her daughter barely recognizable. Hannah, who had already lost more than 40 pounds from an already slight frame, was skeletal. Nicole later said she was skin and bones. She took photographs and videos at the hospital that day, documentation she would later hand over to investigators, because she understood on some primal level that what she was witnessing needed to be remembered exactly as it was. Nicole drove Hannah directly to UAB, the University of Alabama at Birmingham, one of the most capable medical facilities in the state. The drive from Hartselle to Birmingham takes roughly an hour. It is not difficult to imagine that hour, Nicole watching her daughter in the passenger seat, Hannah barely conscious, the Alabama highway unreeling ahead of them, both of them not yet knowing that they were already inside a criminal case. At UAB, the emergency team moved quickly. Hannah's vitals were assessed. She was gravely ill. That much was immediately apparent. Doctors told Nicole they wanted to keep Hannah for observation, but that her vitals were technically stable enough that there was pressure to discharge her. Nicole refused to accept that. She told the medical team, "If you send her home, she is going to die." And then, almost as if her mother's words had named it into being, Hannah seized. It was a grand mal seizure, sudden, violent, total. In the chaos that followed, Hannah ripped off her hospital gown. Her body, as Nicole would later describe it, to 48 hours, was skin and bones. The seizure made the decision for the doctors. Hannah was admitted immediately. She was placed on a ventilator, and within hours of her arrival, within the first 8 days of her hospitalization, according to reporting, doctors ran the tests that would change everything. The X-rays were extraordinary. When the images came back, Lieutenant Alan McDermott of the Hartselle Police Department, who would visit Hannah in the hospital 11 days after her admission, described seeing them for the first time as being floored. Hannah's entire insides, he said, were lit up from the lead reacting to the X-ray. The imaging revealed that her colon was packed, almost completely filled, with dense metallic particles that had no business being inside a human body. As Nicole would later describe it, There was almost no room left for anything else. It was complete lead, she told 48 Hours. Lead in her bones, lead everywhere. There was no room in her stomach to hold anything. The blood tests confirmed what the X-rays suggested. The safe level of lead in an adult's bloodstream is near 10 micrograms per deciliter. When Hannah arrived at UAB, her blood lead level was in the 80s, 8 times the threshold considered dangerous, at concentrations that toxicologists would later testify were not remotely possible through accidental environmental exposure. No amount of old paint, no contaminated water supply, no incidental contact could produce numbers like these. The only way Hannah could have accumulated this much lead in her system was through repeated, deliberate ingestion over an extended period of time. Doctors told Nicole directly, this was not an accident. Someone had been intentionally trying to kill her daughter. The hospital's response was immediate and procedurally decisive. They reported Hannah's case to the Department of Human Resources, the Alabama state agency responsible for protecting vulnerable adults. Hospital administrators placed Hannah in a secluded room with a staff member stationed at the door. No visitors were permitted. Both Nicole and Brian were told to leave. Both of them were, at that point, considered potential suspects. Nicole was sent away from her own daughter's bedside, a moment she described to 48 Hours as being beside herself, a moment frozen in grief and fear and desperate helplessness. It was also at this moment that a detail emerged that doctors could not ignore. When they pressed Nicole about everything Hannah had been eating and consuming in the months before her hospitalization, everything, they told her, no matter what it was, Nicole remembered something. Hannah had mentioned vitamins, special capsules that Brian gave her every night. He had been insistent about them, and doctors had repeatedly asked Brian to bring in the capsules. He never did. Instead, he provided a photograph of common over-the-counter supplements. He did not produce the actual pills. Then Brian made a move that investigators would later view as a critical tell. He told a nurse practitioner at a separate medical facility that he believed he and his children were also being poisoned by lead. He submitted himself for an X-ray. He showed the staff what he presented as evidence of lead in his own system, but when investigators arranged for him to undergo formal, supervised testing, Brian Mann became, according to trial testimony, visibly nervous. The results showed only trace amounts of lead, nothing consistent with genuine ongoing exposure, nothing that resembled the catastrophic saturation found in Hannah's body. In the affidavit filed by Hartselle Police, Captain Alan McDermott stated that investigators believed Mann had intentionally ingested a small amount of lead in order to create the appearance that he was also a victim. The investigation had officially begun, and it had a name, Lieutenant Alan McDermott, and a quiet, methodical determination that would not let go. On January 29, 2022, 11 days after Hannah's admission, McDermott drove to UAB to see her for himself. He found her in a medical coma. Doctors had placed her in a chemically induced unconscious state to drain excess fluid from her body and allow the colon irrigation treatments to work without the additional physiological stress of consciousness. When McDermott saw the X-rays, he asked Brian to come in to speak with investigators. Brian Mann refused. He stopped cooperating with the investigation entirely. In Hartselle, word was beginning to spread. Carefully, quietly, the way things spread in small towns where everyone knows everyone. The Advanced Chiropractic Clinic on 6th Avenue in Decatur put a sign on its door. Office will be closed until further notice. Phone calls went unanswered. The community that had known Brian Mann as a respected professional, as a neighbor, as a father, was beginning to understand that something had gone profoundly wrong. The shock of it would take time to fully register, because this was not how things were supposed to happen in a place like Hartzell. Not in a family home, not with vitamins. Hannah remained hospitalized from January through March 2022, nearly 2 months, undergoing continuous colon irrigation to flush the lead from her body. Doctors would later tell her something that no 22-year-old woman should ever have to hear. The lead had reached her bones. It was lodged in her system in ways that could not be fully remedied. It had saturated her reproductive organs to a degree that rendered her permanently unable to have more children. Hannah Pettey, who had dreamed of a larger family, who adored her 2 small children, who had done nothing more dangerous than trust the man she married, would never be pregnant again. But she was alive. Against the odds that had been stacking against her since August, she was alive. And somewhere across Birmingham, in the days that followed, investigators were quietly piecing together something remarkable. A trail of lead that led directly from a construction site to a bottle of capsules to a woman's nightstand, and then to one man's hands. The question of whether justice would follow was only just beginning to be asked. The investigation that would ultimately bring Brian Thomas Mann to justice began not with a dramatic breakthrough, but with a phone call, the kind made quietly, carefully, by someone who knew something and finally decided that knowing it silently was no longer something they could live with. But before that call came, there was Alan McDiarmid. In late January 2022, the Hartzell Police Department's Lieutenant Alan McDiarmid received a referral from the Alabama Department of Human Resources. DHR had been alerted by UAB Hospital that a young woman was being treated for a level of lead contamination that could only be explained by deliberate, repeated ingestion. McDiarmid, by his own account, was skeptical at first. A DHR told him he needed to go arrest somebody for attempting to kill their wife. His immediate reaction was measured. He needed more than a hospital referral before he could do that. He needed evidence. He needed a case. What he found when he went to UAB on January 29th, 11 days into Hannah's hospitalization, sobered him immediately. Hannah was in a medical coma, placed there by doctors to allow the continuous colon irrigation treatments to work without additional physiological stress. When the medical staff showed McDiarmid the X-rays, he later described his reaction in terms that left no ambiguity. He was floored. The images showed Hannah's entire abdominal cavity lit up with metallic density. Her insides, he said, were illuminated by the lead, the way a skeleton glows under medical imaging. He had never seen anything like it. McDiarmid reached out to Brian Mann and asked him to come in to speak with investigators. Mann's response was immediate and telling. He refused. Within 3 days of his initial partial cooperation with the investigation, Mann had stopped communicating with police except through his attorney. According to McDiarmid, that pivot was, to him, a red flag of the clearest kind. That when investigators are trying to understand what is killing your wife, the instinct to stop cooperating entirely is not the instinct of an innocent man. The early investigation faced a significant obstacle. Physical evidence was elusive. Investigators conducted 2 separate searches for the source of lead at the couple's home and surrounding areas, and initially found nothing that could definitively explain the contamination. In the search warrants for Mann's business and former home, powerful enough to have been built into probable cause, would not be granted until May 2023. The case was, as lead prosecutor Garrick Vickery would later acknowledge, built largely on circumstantial evidence, powerful and damning in its totality, but with little direct physical proof in its early stages. The breakthrough came from the outside. Sometime after Mann's hospital visit, where he had claimed his own lead contamination and then become visibly nervous when pressed for a follow-up scan, an anonymous tipster contacted the Hartselle Police Department. The caller had been involved in a construction project at Brian Mann's chiropractic office, specifically the installation of lead-lined walls for an X-ray room, a standard procedure in medical imaging spaces. The contractor told investigators that when the renovation was complete, surplus lead material had been left behind at the clinic. He told them he had left that extra lead with Mann. That tip was the turning point. It connected the physical substance found saturating Hannah's body to a specific location, Mann's own workplace, and to a specific person who had sole access and the knowledge to use it. Prosecutors would later demonstrate in court that separating lead shavings from construction material and loading them into empty supplement capsules required no specialized expertise. It required only 2 hands, a surface, and a decision. According to trial testimony from lead prosecutor Vickery, the capsule method was deliberate. It was the only mechanism by which Hannah would have swallowed something tasting of metal without knowing it. Armed with the tipster's information, investigators pushed forward. McDormand's team began building the case piece by piece. Medical records, insurance documents, the testimony of the doctors who had treated Hannah, the documentation of Brian's behavior during and after her hospitalization. In September 2022, a grand jury returned an indictment. Brian Thomas Mann was arrested on September 2, 2022, more than 7 months after Hannah had arrived at UAB barely alive and charged with the attempted murder of his wife. His arrest was not clean. Mann posted a $500,000 bond and was conditionally released 5 days later, subject to GPS monitoring, a home curfew, drug testing 8 times per month, and surrender of all firearms. He was required to turn over his passport. He did not. He told investigators he could not find it. The bond was revoked. He was re-jailed. He was eventually granted another release after his attorney argued that he needed to remain free in order to pay child support, and a judge reluctantly complied under strict new conditions. Over the years, between his arrest and his trial, Mann filed multiple motions to modify his bond conditions, attempted to have the presiding judge recused, and had his defense team challenge the admissibility of evidence at nearly every turn, including filing a motion arguing that investigators had improperly extracted lead samples from Hannah's urine using, as the defense described it, a 5-gallon bucket and a strainer in a police department parking lot. The defense's strategy was clear: cast doubt on everything, challenge the methodology, suggest the real perpetrator might be Nicole, Hannah's mother, who had also had access to her daughter during the period of poisoning. Point to the circumstantial nature of the evidence. Mann's attorney, Chad Morgan, argued that there was no reason any of the state's evidence should reach the courtroom. He maintained his client's innocence publicly and forcefully throughout the 3-year period between arrest and trial. Jury selection for the trial of Brian Thomas Mann began on June 9, 2025, in Decatur, Alabama, 3 years and 9 months after Hannah had been admitted to UAB at the edge of death. The Morgan County Courthouse carried the weight of the case that week. No cameras were permitted inside during testimony. Hannah was the state's first witness. She was 25 years old. She had feared, during the long months of her hospitalization, and that the lead damage might render her cognitively incapable of testifying, that the encephalopathy caused by the toxin would take her memory, her clarity, her voice. It had not. She walked into that courtroom, took the stand, and told her story in full. She described the vitamins. She described the nightstand. She described the evenings when she was too sick to swallow anything, and Brian would insist, would place the capsules there, would wait. She described the ankle weights he made her wear when doctors weighed her, to conceal how drastically her body had deteriorated. She described being kept from her own family, being isolated inside her marriage, being gaslit into questioning whether she was truly as sick as she felt, and then being gaslit further after the hospitalization as Brian urged her to stop the investigation. He had called it a mistake, asked her to let it go. She testified that many of the insurance policies had been taken out after she became ill. She testified that while she lay in the hospital, he had expressed more concern about whether the insurance policies would be honored than about whether she would live. The state presented 7 witnesses over a day and a half. Dr. Felicia Hathaway of UAB testified that a safe adult blood lead level is near 10 micrograms per deciliter. Hannah's had been in the 80s upon admission. The insurance agent, Chris Humphreys, testified about the multiple policies across multiple companies, a pattern he described as throwing spaghetti at the wall, a buyer trying to maximize payout while avoiding the scrutiny any single insurer would apply to unusually large coverage on one person. The prosecution also presented the critical X-ray evidence, images in which Hannah's body, from colon to bones, appeared suffused with metallic density. The physical reality of what had been done to her was visible in those images. The jury could see it. The defense called no witnesses, 0. After the state rested, Mann's legal team presented nothing. The jury began deliberating on the evening of June 11th. They resumed the following morning. At 10:15 a.m. on June 12th, 2025, after a total of less than 3 hours of deliberation, they returned to the courtroom, guilty of attempted murder. Brian Thomas Mann stood solemn and silent in a dark suit as the verdict was read. Deputies handcuffed him and escorted him from the courtroom to a holding room. As he was led out, a voice from the gallery called out, "I love you. I'm Brian." Hannah walked out of the courtroom glassy-eyed and tearful. She later said it took a few seconds for the verdict to truly register, and then she felt the tears well up. She stepped outside. She had survived the poisoning, the hospitalization, the years of legal limbo, the trial, and the testimony. She had done all of it. Juror Jeff Solly, speaking to 48 Hours after the verdict, did not mince words about what he believed Brian Mann to be. He called him a monster. The word landed with the full weight of the evidence behind it. On August 27th, 2025, 10 weeks after the guilty verdict, Brian Mann appeared in the Morgan County courtroom for sentencing. He was shackled now, dressed in jail garb rather than the dark suit. He stood beside his attorney, who asked the court for mercy. Mann himself said nothing at all. He did not address the court. He offered no statement, no acknowledgement, no expression of remorse. Judge Charles Elliott, who had presided over the case for years, spoke with quiet and measured gravity about what he had witnessed. He noted that in over 6.5 years as a circuit judge across hundreds of trials, He had never once seen a defendant snickering during the state's closing arguments, until Brian Mann. He described the medical testimony from trial as jarring. He described Mann's behavior as Mann's wife deteriorated, continuing to push for additional insurance coverage even as her body was being slowly destroyed, as something that reflected profoundly and permanently on Mann's character. Elliott sentenced Brian Thomas Mann to life in prison. He went further. He asked the district attorney's office to notify him personally when Mann became eligible for parole so that he could travel to Montgomery himself to testify against his release. Lead prosecutor Garrick Vickery addressed the courtroom and the press with unflinching clarity. The crime, he said, was not some small issue that got out of control. It was a daily decision made over months to kill his wife. He told the room that what Hannah would carry in her body, the lead still lodged in her bones, the infertility, the chronic pain in her hands, the neurological effects that might never fully resolve, could never be given back to her. The sentence, he said, was as close to justice as could be achieved, not justice itself, as close as the law could reach. Hannah was in the courtroom during the sentencing, seated beside her mother, Nicole. Both of them declined to speak to the media afterward. They walked out together. There is a particular kind of courage required to walk back into the house where someone tried to kill you. Not the courage of the dramatic gesture, the press conference, the public statement, the tearful interview. Those things have their own demands. The courage required to walk back through a front door, to stand in a kitchen where poison was prepared, to put your children's drawings on the walls and call it home again, that is something quieter, something fiercer, something that does not translate easily into words. It is the courage of someone who has decided, with full knowledge of what happened, to keep living anyway. Hannah Pettey made that choice. She made it more than once, in more ways than most people will ever have to. When Hannah was discharged from UAB Hospital in March 2022, after nearly 2 months of colon irrigation, chelation therapy, medically induced coma, grand mal seizures, and a level of physical suffering that the medical staff who witnessed it described as unlike anything they had encountered, she weighed a fraction of what she had weighed before the poisoning began. She had lost more than 45 pounds from an already small frame. There was still lead in her bones. There would always be lead in her bones. She was 22 years old. 2 days after her discharge, she filed for divorce. The road from that filing to any kind of settled life would take years and encompass enormous loss. The divorce proceedings were paused during Brian Mann's criminal trial, or a legal entanglement that meant Hannah remained, technically, legally married to the man who had tried to kill her while she rebuilt her life from scratch. As of the CBS 48 Hours broadcast in January 2026, their divorce remained unresolved, with the next court date set for December 2026. A surreal postscript to an already surreal ordeal. As of today, in April 2026, that divorce proceeding is still pending. But Hannah did not wait for legal finality to begin reclaiming herself. She returned to school, enrolling at Athens State University to pursue the dream she had held quietly throughout the years of her marriage and illness, a degree in elementary education. In December 2024, she graduated with a teaching degree and with a resilience that had been tested in ways that her professors could not have imagined when she sat in their classrooms. It is worth pausing on what that graduation represents. Medical staff at UAB had once feared that the neurological damage caused by the lead saturation in her brain might be severe enough to prevent her from ever testifying coherently at trial. She graduated from college. She became a teacher. By 2025, Hannah had taken a position as a second-grade teacher at Chestnut Grove Elementary School, a room full of 7-year-olds who needed someone patient, attentive, and deeply committed to the work of helping small people grow. By every account, she found that work meaningful. She told CBS that her focus now was on being the best teacher she could be and the best mother she could be. And those two sentences contain multitudes. They are the sentences of someone who has looked directly at how fragile life is and decided to fill it with purpose anyway. In September 2025, after 4 years and 5 separate moves, the displacement of a woman forced to rebuild her life from a succession of temporary addresses, Hannah and her children finally returned to the Hartzell home she had once shared with Brian, the house where the poison had been prepared, the house where the capsules had been placed on her nightstand. She repainted it. She redecorated it. She filled it with photographs of herself and her children, Lincoln and Gracie, who were now 6 and 5 years old, who had grown up in the shadow of a trial and a father's conviction without fully understanding what any of it meant, who deserved bedrooms that felt safe and a mother who was present. Hannah told CBS the house now felt like theirs. She said she chose to focus on the good memories and to build a lifetime of new ones. That December, Christmas 2025, she surprised Lincoln and Gracie with a puppy named Tux. It is one of those small, vivid details that says everything. A puppy named Tux. A house that is theirs. A teacher standing at the front of a classroom. These are the coordinates of a life being rebuilt with intention and love. One ordinary morning at a time. Nicole Pettey, the mother whose instinct saved her daughter's life on January 18th, 2022, who called and called and called until Hannah finally picked up, remains one of the most important people in Hannah's world. Their bond, always close, none was forged into something unbreakable by what they survived together. Nicole was the first person to advocate for Hannah at the hospital when doctors considered sending her home. She was the one who was sent away from her daughter's bedside when both she and Brian were treated as suspects, and who fought to be cleared so she could return. She sat in that courtroom in August 2025 beside her daughter during the sentencing. They walked out together without speaking to the press. Some things do not need to be said for a watching world. As for Brian Thomas Mann, he is currently incarcerated at Kilby Correctional Facility in Montgomery County, Alabama, the state's intake and evaluation center for male inmates, where he awaits assignment to a long-term state prison. His attorneys filed a formal appeal of his conviction in October 2025. When Judge Elliott denied a defense motion to supplement or correct the appellate record. As of early 2026, the appeal is ongoing, with procedural motions still being filed and litigated. He remains behind bars during the appeals process, a court having determined he does not meet the standard for release while the matter is pending. He has maintained his innocence throughout. He said nothing at his sentencing. What this case reveals about the world we live in is uncomfortable and important in equal measure. It reveals, first, that domestic violence does not require a bruise or a visible wound to be catastrophic. Hartzell Police Chief Alan McDiarmid, who has spoken publicly and repeatedly about the lessons of this case, described the gaslighting at the heart of it with precision. It is the systematic psychological manipulation of someone into doubting their own sanity, memory, and ability to reason. It is invisible, it leaves no marks. And it is, as McDiarmid noted, very common in domestic violence situations. Hannah had been told, in ways both explicit and implied, that her judgment could not be trusted about her health, about her safety, about the person sleeping beside her. That is why she kept taking the capsules. That is why she struggled for months before her mother intervened. Not because she was naive or weak, but because manipulation of that depth and duration erodes the very faculties a person needs to protect themselves. This case also reveals the terrifying gap that can exist between a person's public presentation and their private reality. Brian Mann was respected. He was reviewed well. He was, by all outward signs, a competent professional and a present father. The evil he did to Hannah was invisible to everyone who knew him because he intended it that way. He counted on it. The capsules looked like vitamins because they were designed to. The kindness he showed Hannah as her body began to fail was performance, not love. And the community of Heart Cell, close-knit, faith-grounded, the kind of place where people believe they know their neighbors, was forced to absorb the knowledge that the ordinary-looking house on Coleman Street had been the site of a 5-month calculated attempt to end a young woman's life. But the case has also prompted reflection on the medical and investigative systems that nearly missed it entirely. Hannah visited doctors multiple times before her hospitalization with symptoms that were severe and escalating. No one identified the cause. It was not until she arrived at UAB, nearly incapacitated, and underwent comprehensive testing that the lead was discovered. Had Nicole not refused to let the initial treating team discharge Hannah on that January evening, had she not said explicitly, "If you send her home, she will die," and had Hannah not seized almost immediately afterward, the outcome might have been different. The margin between Hannah's survival and her death in those first hours at UAB was measured in minutes. Lead prosecutor Garrick Vickery described the moral reality of the case in the starkest possible terms. He told the court and the press that what Brian Mann did was not a momentary lapse or a loss of control. It was a daily decision, made again and again over 5 months, each capsule placed on a nightstand, a renewed choice to continue. The pursuit of money, Vickery said, was his only goal. The $1.3 million, the relief from a difficult divorce, the calculation that a dead wife was more valuable to him than a living one. There are still lead particles in Hannah Pettey's bones. They will be there for the rest of her life. They are the permanent physical record of what was done to her, a record she carries in her skeleton that shows up in her blood work, that contributed to the infertility she learned about at 22 years old, that causes the chronic pain in her hand she mentioned from the witness stand. She cannot give those things back. No verdict can remove them. No life sentence can undo the 5 months of poison, or the years of displacement, or the children who grew up watching their mother rebuild herself from nothing, or the future children Hannah will never have. What justice could do, what it did, was confirm, in the most public and permanent way available, that what happened to Hannah was real, that she was not imagining it, that she was not weak or confused or ungrateful, that she was being killed, slowly, by someone who smiled at her while it was happening. The verdict gave that truth the weight of law. Hannah has said she has forgiven Brian Mann. She said it in the days after the verdict with her characteristic quiet composure. She has forgiven him, and she wishes he would change someday for himself and for his children. It is one of the most remarkable things about her that after everything, forgiveness was something she chose to extend, not because it was easy, but because carrying the alternative would have cost her more than she was willing to pay. That kind of grace is not weakness. It is a form of self-preservation that Brian Mann, for all his calculated planning, never possessed and never will. She is a teacher now. She is a mother. She is a woman who survived something unsurvivable and chose, anyway, to fill her house with photos and paint the walls a new color and bring a puppy home for Christmas. Her name is Hannah Victoria Pettey. She is 26 years old as of 2026. She was poisoned by the person who was supposed to love her most in the world, systematically, deliberately, over 5 months. And she lived. She graduated. She testified. When she went back to the house and made it hers, the world is immeasurably brighter for the fact that she is still in it. Hannah, the children in your classroom are lucky. Lincoln and Gracie are lucky. We are lucky you are here.